Over the last 80 years or so, Ferrari has become a household name. Everybody knows it, and we all have our favorite cars that they've put out over that time period. Some of them are incredibly iconic, such as the Ferrari F40, which has pretty much defined what it means to be a supercar in a lot of ways. But before there were F40s, there were Formula One cars. And Formula One started in 1950, and in 1951, Ferrari ran the 375 F1, which is the first purpose-built Formula One car. So in this video, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking a look at this Ferrari collection from Kyosho. This was a collaboration between Kyosho and Dido, and these were kits that were put out for a selection of Ferrari Formula One cars. There were a total of 20 cars put out in two different collections, and the cars span from 1951 to 2003. And my understanding is that these had to be sold as kits because at the time Mattel owned the licensing for Ferrari diecast cars in 1/64 scale, or perhaps even all scales. I'm not sure. But there was a loophole that allowed the Ferrari license to be used by other companies if they simply sold the cars as kits. And so that is what Kyosho did. And they put out not only Formula One cars, they also put out lines of street cars that I believe were also sold as kits. But for this video, we're going to be focusing on Formula One cars, and we're going to go through and take a look at each of these cars in turn. And this is a fascinating thing because it really shows you the evolution of Formula One and how the cars developed into the things that they are today. And the first one we have is this 375 F1, and Enzo is here holding his place of honor on the first Ferrari Formula One car. Enzo may have even driven this car at various points in time because he was originally a race car driver. He started out driving for, I believe it was Alfa Romeo in the 30s and 40s, or they've been in early 40s, before World War II, because they're all racing kind of ended during World War II. So we're going to move Enzo back to his usual place in his 365 and take a look at these little Ferrari Formula One gems. So the cars at this time were front engine, had the radiator in the front, very thin tires, treaded tires. I believe they had drum brakes, so they were not the world's most agile vehicles. They were fast in a straight line. They took a really long time to slow down, and they were quite primitive by modern standards, obviously. But the cars didn't have a whole lot of features, including seatbelts. There were no seatbelts on racing cars at this time and through the late 60s because drivers preferred to be thrown clear of the car rather than being trapped in the car and having the car catch on fire. So that was a weird characteristic. Safety was an afterthought at this time, more than it was a focus as it is now. It was not at all uncommon for drivers to be killed in races, and sometimes multiple drivers a year, which never happens now, or almost never happens now, which is a very good thing. So this was the 1951 car, the 375 F1. The next one is the 500 F2, and so this is technically a Formula 2 car, but in 1952 the World Championship was run under Formula 2 rules. And in the 50s and 60s, it was not at all uncommon for drivers to race in multiple series. So they often raced in both Formula 2 and Formula 1, and then they would even come to the United States and race in IndyCar and sports cars and what have you. Whereas now, that doesn't happen. Formula 1 drivers drive Formula 1 cars, and then they rarely drive anything else. And Formula 2 is a feeder series for Formula 1, so it's where drivers go to get their experience and training. But in the 50s, that wasn't necessarily the case. And so the 500 F2 was, like I said, basically it was their Formula 1 car, but it was built to the Formula 2 rules. And again, it was still a fairly primitive car. It was not a huge change over the prior vehicle. Again, you had very low sides, easy to get in and out of the car, and no seat belts, and still thin tires, and front radiator, front engine. So these early Formula One cars are for me, are definitely the most interesting out of this set. It's just fascinating, and there was a lot of change as we look at these. There was a lot of change through the first 30 years, and then we'll see as we get into the 2000s that the cars started to become much more similar year to year. Although in details there's still a lot of difference. Okay, so that is not the one we're looking at. So this is the D50. This car started out as a Lancia, and then was development continued on it as a Ferrari for another year or two. And it's a very interesting design because it's still a front engine car, but they mounted the engine at an angle so that they could make the car lower. So if you compare it to the prior car, you can see that this car is much taller in here. So they turn the engine so that they could lower the car, and then they move the fuel cells into these pods on the outside so that they could, keep the car lower. And this was kind of the trend in the design of the cars, was to make them longer and lower as time goes on. Again, no seat belts and thin tires still, and still a front engine design. Then the next one is the 246 F1, and this one reverted to having the fuel tanks built into the vehicle, and still a front engine car, radiators in the front, and still thin tires and so on. I'm not sure the reason why they routed these exhausts along the side of the car in this way, but it's an interesting design feature. Well, I guess here, if we look at this one, the exhausts, they simply just fired out the front. So maybe the drivers got tired of having the exhaust hit them in the face when the wind blew in the wrong direction or something. I don't know. But yeah, so very cool. And then this next one is the Dino 156 F1. This car is otherwise known, or most affectionately known, as the Sharknose. And that's because of this radiator design, or these air inlets on the front. And this is the first of the cars in this set that have a rear engine design. So the engine has been moved behind the driver, or I guess it's probably more of a mid-engine design, not so much a rear engine, because rear engine would put it out here, but it's up in here. Keeps the balance of the car, or the weight distribution of the car, a little bit more even. But the Sharknose is a very famous Formula One car design, just because it was so distinctive. And unfortunately, at the time, it was customary for Ferrari to destroy their racing cars when they were done with them. So all of the original Sharknoses were destroyed, and any Sharknose that you see today is a replica, and there's been a number of them produced. but it's crazy, and I'm sure that Ferrari probably regrets pretty strongly destroying all of these early Formula One cars, because these things would be just, I mean, I can't even imagine how much they would be worth now. But this one's very cool. It's a, like I said, it's a very famous design. Now we get into the 60s, and this is the 158 F1, and here the car has taken a big step forward. So it's still a rear engine design, but is a much lower, much smaller car, and it's starting to get a little bit wider tires. Still has treads. They hadn't gone to slicks at this stage, but they were. It was starting to show more of the characteristics of true racing cars. It was sat lower, had lower ride height, and just was getting longer and lower and sleeker overall. This one's beautiful. I love the blue wheels on it. I think that looks pretty cool, and it's a unique character of this particular car. So again, this was the 158 F1. Beautiful. Love this one. This one's definitely one of my favorites in this set. Next up is the 312B. This is from 1970. And this is obviously notable because of the introduction of wings. This is very early Aerodynamics. I'm not sure if this was the first Ferrari that had wings. Ferrari did not introduce wings into racing. Other companies did this first, but they of course followed along. And as you can see, if we compare this to this one, the tires have gotten much wider, and both front and rear. And the rear tires have gotten even bigger than the fronts. So they really started to run asymmetric tire widths. They were doing it on this one, but this one really steps it up. But very early aero, very primitive. Still a rear mid-engine design. Driver's still sitting pretty far back, and but this was it was around this time, it was when they really started to discover the value of aerodynamics, and a lot of effort started to be put into designing the cars to have high downforce levels so that to increase cornering speeds. Now we get into 1970s, 1975 in the 312T, and this is another very famous car. This was driven by Niki Lauda, and the Formula One cars at this time had these very distinctive scoops, air inlets that just sat very high and way up out of the airflow of the vehicles. They only did this for a few years, and then they went away. As you'll see, this is the only car in this set that has this characteristic. But this is the period where the car starts to kind of take on the shape that we know today, in Formula One cars, and they have continued to evolve, and they've gotten much bigger and longer and lower, and the complexity of the aerodynamics on the vehicles has increased 1,000-fold. But the core shape of the car kind of emerged around this time with the front and the rear wings, and how the rear wing sits kind of out, and it's really where it starts to kind of settle down a little bit. This is the first car that we've looked at that has slicks and has very small front tires and incredibly huge rear tires. And these cars had a lot of power. So this has 495 horsepower, which doesn't sound like that much, given how readily available street cars are now with 495 horsepower. But these were very light cars, and then they were starting to produce a lot of downforce, so the cornering speeds were very high. But Niki Lauda was famous, and I don't know if this was the car that he was driving when this happened, but he was in a horrible accident on the Nürburgring that he was, I was talking about seatbelts. He was strapped into the car and he couldn't get out, and the car burst into flames, and he was badly burned, and was scarred for life because of that. Next up is the 312T2. So this is 1976. So this is 1 year later from the car that we just looked at. But it's still a fairly significant evolution. So you can see the big air scoop is gone. The rear wing has gotten bigger. The front wing has gotten bigger. And the car is a little bit longer. And but they did introduce a roll bar here, and the rear tires appear to have gotten a little bit bigger. I mean, I don't know how truly accurate, did Kyosho really measure the width of these rear tires to get them correct? I really don't know. But these seem pretty good. I'm assuming that these are 1/64 scale. I haven't measured them. I did think about doing that, but they seem to be reasonably correct to me. Just from casual observation, I would say. So it was 312T2 from 1976, then the 312T4 from 1979, and again, not a dramatic departure. So one characteristic of the Ferraris from the 70s, and you can see that on all three of these cars from the 70s, is the way that this front wing kind of sits on top of the nose cone. And the nose cone is very, very small and thin. This car got this weird shelf here, which I think was some early aerodynamic work on the body, trying to streamline that. And then this also has these ramps up, trying to direct airflow over the rear wing, I believe. This particular one has a very small rear wing, but obviously Formula One teams run different aero packages on different tracks. So high-speed tracks like Monza, they'll run a much lower downforce aero package than they will on something like Monaco, where they'll run a very high downforce package because the track is so tight and narrow and low speed overall. But so this was the last of the cars from the 70s. This is from 1979. Oh, the thing that's notable about this one, compared to this one, is that the driver's seating position is moving forward in these cars. If you compare them, the driver is like they're pushing the driver forward in the vehicle. And I think that's to move the engine forward. But this was a really bad thing for them to do, because Formula One cars, the driver sits in basically almost a prone position, and they were starting to begin to do that at this time. And when you do that, you have the driver here and the driver sitting prone, and then that means that their feet are now sticking out, so their feet are crammed into this area in here, which is really bad because it's in front of the wheel line. And they had a lot of injuries because of, when this car crashed, all of this got swept away, and the driver's feet would be exposed. But it took them another, 10 or 15 years to figure that out. So as we look at these next cars, we'll see the driver's position just keeps moving forward, and eventually they did realize that was a bad idea, and they changed the design of the cars to move the driver back. So you can see on this one how far forward the seating position is, even relative to the one we were just looking at. If you look at the line of the front wheel, it's even further forward. And so this was the 126C2 from 1982. And this one has the engine's kind of exposed, so that the body work that this had, to redirecting the airflow over the wing and what have you, is now gone. and the car has got a very small front wing and a relatively small back wing, and it seems to have airflow through the side pods. There's no other inlets or anything on it, which I guess this one had that as well. But yeah, these because the driving position got moved so far forward and they have this kind of a stubby front end, this era of cars looked a little weird to me, but it's cool. All right, so then the next one is the 126C4. And here you see a big step up in the amount of aero on the vehicle. Again, it's a very forward driving position, and you have huge front wing and then a huge rear wing. And I'm sure that this was the configuration that they ran at Monaco. I can't imagine that they ran this size of a rear wing at every track, and it would be consistent with the type of changes that they would run at Monaco. And this has, it has the main big element on the rear wing, and then these two side pods or side wings that are kind of interesting. And this is the era of cars that I'm the least familiar with. The 80s, the early 80s is I didn't pay attention to Formula One at that time, and I haven't found it interesting enough to go back and really learn about the vehicles. So for me, it's been very fascinating to get to look at this era of car, because I haven't even really read any books or anything on this era. So this is very cool. So okay, so that was 1984. Then we have 1988 and the F187. And this is getting close to the era where I first started paying attention to Formula One, and so I find these cars to be particularly cool. It's the next one is the one I most remember from my early Formula One watching experiences. But the big change in these vehicles, obviously the tires, they've gotten bigger. The front tires are bigger. The wings are a little bit bigger than like the 70s cars. The driving position is still fairly far forward, but they've removed everything that was in here. So these early cars like this one, they've really opened up that area around the front wheels and made very defined side pods for the airflow. And then this would be, I believe, for brake cooling, which this model doesn't have the detail to really show that. But these were running Goodyear tires. I didn't make any note. These don't have any branding on the tires. Maybe that didn't happen until later. This is Goodyear tires. So Formula One cars have changed tire providers through the years. Tires, for a race car, tires are a very important element, and there have been many controversies around tires and how well they perform, and differences between different manufacturers, and even some very controversial races, like a race at Indy where the tires, one manufacturer's tires could not handle the banking, and they all of the teams that were running those tires ended up boycotting the race. So the race started with, like, I don't know what it was, 6 cars or something. It was something silly. But so, okay, now we're into the 90s, and the F92 AT. And this is definitely the era of Formula One where I really started to pay attention. And here you've begun to get a much bigger front wing. The rear wing has moved forward a little bit, and the car now has a very defined floor. And this is a characteristic that's been carried through to modern F1 cars. The floor was it's still fairly confined to the shape of the upper body, but it's definitely a very defined thing. And the side pods, they started to work on the aerodynamics of the side pods, so narrowing the air inlets. And the track of the cars seems to have gotten wider. Maybe this is just a characteristic of the... Yeah, no, they've definitely... Well, maybe not so much. A little bit. But... this was definitely the era. I mean, and again, I don't know how accurate these things are, but this was definitely an era. The cars did appear to be very wide, and long and sleek. But I love this one. This is definitely a favorite of mine. Okay, I need to pick up the pace. This is going fairly slowly here. So the 412 T2, and we're gonna try to go through these a little bit faster because the differences are beginning to narrow between the vehicles. The core design has started to solidify, and there's lots of detail differences, but not huge, not as big as there were in the early days. But yeah, so this one has some interesting aero features in here with the rear wing, and they've introduced this side aero here. I don't know if these would have been called barge boards yet. Modern F1 cars have barge boards here, and then there's some aero in here under the wheels, which is interesting. And yeah, so I was just saying there weren't many changes, but then we get a big change right here. So this is the 1996 F310, and this is the where you start to see the wing drop away from the nose cone. So you had this weird riser, or I don't know what you would call it, but to separate the wing from the nose cone. So I'm not entirely clear what the principle of that was, but it didn't last. Well, it lasted for a while, because actually all of the other cars in this set do have that characteristic, but it did go away eventually, and modern cars do not have this. But otherwise, the cars, the rest of the car is fairly similar. Is the rear area. It's pretty different in here. Shape of these scoops has definitely changed. But okay, again, I was trying to go faster. Let's see. There's only 4 left, and these start to get to be quite similar to each other. So this is the F300 from 1998. And it still, has the drop nose. You start to see a little bit more definition in these end plates. So the prior version, they were straight up and down. Now they've got a little bit of a curve to them. Also, the cars at this time were running grooved tires. So this car has slicks. This car has grooved tires. Which was apparently done in an attempt to slow the cars down, which I don't think it really made much of a difference, or may have slowed them temporarily, but every time they've tried to slow Formula One cars down, the teams find a way to speed them back up. So, yep, okay, cool. Again, I'm trying to go faster. So here, this is the 2000 F1 2000, and here you can see the car has definitely gotten lower and longer, I believe. If we compare these, are they actually longer? Oh yeah, so quite a bit longer. And somewhere in here, actually we should go back and look, So somewhere in here you can see, between these two, you can see where the driver's seating position has moved. So here it was very far forward, and then here it was moved backwards. And you can see how the car got longer even at this point, because they needed to increase the length of the car so that they can move the driver's seating position back behind the front wheels. So if we line up the front wheels, you can see that the driver's seating position is back. But if we line up the rear wheels, the driver's seating position is actually in the same place, but his feet are no longer sticking out in front of the axle for the front wheels, which was much better from a safety perspective. Yeah, hopefully that was true. Hopefully this one may still have been a little bit far forward, because if I look at some of these other ones, like this one definitely you can see that the seating position has been moved way back. And this one, the car's actually even shorter, but I don't know exactly what year they made that change, because this was a 80s car. Anyway, okay, again, trying to go faster. There's only two more. So the F2002, which is this one, looks very similar to the last one. Both very long, very low. And they're now running Bridgestone tires instead of Goodyear's. And you can see that here's where you see a lot of, like, the core of the car. If you just look at these superficially, they're very similar. But if you look at the details, you can see a lot of variation in the aero here. And if you could actually look at the real cars, you would find, tons and tons of variation in the details around all of the aero features on the vehicles. And that is especially true on the modern cars, although the size is different. This one's quite a bit shorter, which is interesting, and smaller. I don't know. I really hope these are to scale. I hope they didn't just futz around with scale. This would be interesting to look at what the regulations were that would result in this car being so much smaller than the one prior. But it happens. They've tried to make the car smaller, but then whatever rules they wrote to make the car smaller, they then removed, and now the modern cars are huge. They've gotten ridiculously large, and so large, in fact, that they have problems running at Monaco now. Or really, they can run there, but it's a really boring race because they can't pass each other. All right, so this is the last one, F2003GA, and it's going to be fairly similar to the ones we were just looking at. Bridgestone tires, and let's just do a quick size comparison. Yeah, so this is still the smaller design, and again, you can see, if you look in this area here, you can see the differences in the aero. And it had these weird little winglets here at the front. These had a name, which I'm going to forget what these were called. Some of them, they looked really strange. Like here, you don't really notice them that much, but on some cars, they would stick way up out of the, off the back of the car, and they just look really goofy. But that was a feature that was eventually banned as well. In modern cars are not allowed to do that. So there is some interesting, element in here. This razor edge, or a stepped edge along the floor area, which is interesting. If you look at a modern car, this area in here has, the floor will extend out further, and there's barge boards, and there is so much aero, just little tiny winglets, and just it's amazing the amount of detail that they've put into trying to control the airflow across the entire car. But this area is, compared to these cars, this is an area where there's been a big evolution of aerodynamic capabilities. But anyway, okay. So this was the Kyosho Ferrari collection, Formula One collection, both parts, or set 1 and set 2, and This video ended up being a little bit longer than I had hoped it would be, but hopefully you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you next time. Thank you.